The coffee cup sat on the mahogany table in front of Emily, and she watched the dark liquid tremble with the smallest movement of her hand. She didn't remember ordering it. Jonathan Pierce must have had it brought in, along with the box of tissues nobody had touched yet. The tissues were still sealed in their plastic wrapper, which felt like an indictment of her composure. Grief was supposed to make you weep. It was supposed to crack you open. Instead, she sat very still in a black dress that had belonged to someone else's funeral just 6 months prior, watching her coffee vibrate like it was trying to escape. Jonathan's voice was methodical and kind. He'd been her uncle's attorney for 23 years, and he spoke the way someone does when they've delivered this particular message many times before, though never to someone like her. Never to someone whose entire world had just reorganized itself while they were choosing between the navy dress and the black one. "The majority shareholding passes to you," he said, adjusting his glasses. 72%. Your uncle was very clear on that point. He also established a trust for Margaret. She'll have housing, health care, and a discretionary fund for the rest of her life. The house on Maple is yours, the investment accounts, the liquid assets, and operational control of Carter & Rowe Home Co. as of the reading of this will. Emily heard the words. They entered her ears like information about a distant country she'd never visit. 72% of a company her uncle had built from a single showroom in 1997 into a 7-figure retailer known across the Pacific Northwest for impossible quality and ruthless customer service. Her uncle had been that service. A man with an encyclopedic knowledge of fabrication and finish work, who could spot a seam flaw from across a room, and who had trained every senior staff member the way a musician trains an orchestra. Now they all reported to Emily, who had been operations director for 4 years and had never expected to be anything but that, for as long as she worked there. She felt the cup trembling again and clasped both hands around it. The warmth was good, steadying. "There's also," Jonathan continued, and Emily heard the pause before he said the next part, the careful pause of a lawyer who knew what was coming. "Documentation related to your parents." The coffee went very still in her hands. "Your uncle maintained a file, for some years now. It contains correspondence, contact attempts, and a private investigator's reports. He wanted you to have context before this was settled." Emily said nothing. She had learned a very long time ago, at an age too young to have learned it, that information was a gift you didn't look at until you were alone. So she only nodded, and Jonathan slid a gray folder across the desk, and it made a soft shushing sound against the wood. "There's something else," he said. "Your parents have been notified of the death. I sent a formal letter, as is standard, but I didn't—" He paused again, and in that pause, Emily understood that something had already happened. "I didn't expect them to respond within the hour." The knock on the door came from outside the office suite. Jonathan's assistant's voice, apologetic, filtered through a moment later. The door opened without any of the softness that had characterized the morning so far. The man who entered first was wearing a suit that probably cost what Margaret spent on groceries for 6 months, and Emily recognized his face the way you recognize a photograph of a historical figure, with intellectual knowledge but no emotional resonance. Daniel Carter, her biological father. 17 years since she'd seen him in person. The woman behind him was smaller, softer, with blonde hair gone mostly gray. Laura, her mother. Emily had spent a portion of her childhood listening for their car in the driveway, and another portion learning not to listen for anything at all. "Emily," her father's voice held the warmth of a realtor greeting a client. "We came as soon as we heard. We wanted to be here for you." The coffee cup was steady in her hands now. That was interesting. Fear usually made her shake. Grief made her shake. But looking at the two of them, standing in Jonathan's office like they'd been invited, Emily felt something settle into her chest like a stone. Cold. Heavy. True. "You heard," she said quietly. "The funeral home notification," her mother said. She had always been the softer one, the one who sometimes looked at Emily with something that might have been regret, if regret could move, if it could speak. They listed family contacts. Emily had never put her parents down as family contacts. She couldn't imagine who had, but the logistics didn't matter. What mattered was the way her father's eyes had moved around the room, cataloging. The office, Jonathan, the folder, the view. His daughter, sitting in a black dress holding a coffee cup, holding the future. "I'm grateful you made the time," Emily said, and watched her father's jaw relax slightly. He'd believed the words. That's what his face said, that he'd believed she was grateful, that this was a normal family moment, that 17 years of silence had been something other than a choice they'd made when she was still learning to read. "We know this is a shock," her mother began, and something in her tone made Emily's grip tighten enough that her knuckles went white. "Not shock." The tone said, "We know this is something we can use. You're so young to handle something this big. We knew that you might need support." "Emily just inherited a substantial company and real estate," Jonathan interjected, and there was something sharp in his voice now, something protective. "I think you'll find she has all the support she needs. Now, I'm sure you understand that this is a confidential meeting between a client and her attorney. I'll need to ask you to leave." Her father stood very still. Emily watched him calculate. She could see it happening, watched his eyes do the math of the office, the folder, the attorney who was moving his own body between them and Emily like a human barrier. She wondered what he'd thought would happen when he walked in. That she would cry, that she would be grateful, that 17 years of abandonment would dissolve in a single moment of mutual loss. "We're her parents," he said quietly. "Surely we can have a moment alone with our daughter." Emily looked at Jonathan. Then she looked at her parents. The moment held like a breath, and in that moment, she felt something arrive in her that had no name yet. Clarity, maybe. Or the beginning of understanding that the child in her who had waited by the window was finally, irreversibly dead. "No," she said, "you can't." Her mother's face did something complicated. Her father's did not change. After a long moment, he turned toward the door. Her mother hesitated, and Emily saw her mouth open as if to say something, saw her decide against it. And then they were gone, and Jonathan was closing the door softly behind them, and Emily was alone with her coffee and the gray folder and the terrible, clarifying knowledge that nothing was ever going to be the same. She set the cup down finally and opened the folder. That night, she sat in the house on Maple with Margaret, and Margaret brought her tea because it was what Margaret brought in moments that required something warm and patient. Margaret had been there when Emily was 10 years old, and her uncle had lifted her from the car seat where she'd been sleeping, had carried her upstairs to a room with fresh sheets and a small bookcase already full of stories. Margaret had been there for every morning after that, for 17 years of every morning. "They came to see you," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. To Jonathan's office, yes. Margaret's hands were steady as she poured. Margaret's hands were always steady. And I told them no. Margaret set the teapot down and looked at Emily across the kitchen table, and in her eyes was something that looked like pride. "Your uncle always said you would be strong. I told him you were so young, too young to understand what he was teaching you. But he said strength wasn't about age. He said it was about seeing clearly." Emily had looked through most of the folder by then. The private investigator's reports were clinical and thorough. Her parents had attempted contact twice. Once when Emily was 14, once when she was 22. Both times they'd cited financial difficulty. Both times they'd disappeared when they discovered the initial contact would go through Robert, not directly to Emily. There were documents from an earlier time, from before she came to live with her uncle. Relinquishment of parental rights. And a check, deposited $23,000, dated the same day the paperwork was signed. "They sold me," Emily had said when she saw it, and it came out as a statement of fact, not a question. Jonathan had nodded slowly. "For $23,000, he confirmed, which was, according to my research, approximately equal to the amount of debt they were carrying at that time. Your uncle's position was always that it had cost him very little to become your legal guardian. He preferred to think of it as the cheapest, best investment he'd ever made. Now Margaret was looking at her with those eyes that knew everything, and Emily realized she didn't need to say what was in the folder. Margaret already knew. Margaret had probably helped her uncle understand it in the first place. The worst part, Emily said slowly, is that I don't feel sad about it. Not now. I felt sad when I was a child. I remember feeling sad. But when I look at those documents, I feel like I'm holding a piece of evidence. I feel like I finally have proof of something I already knew. Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand on Emily's, the way she'd done when Emily was 10, and the dreams had been bad. Your uncle knew that you would understand eventually. That's why he kept the records. Not to hurt you, to protect you, and to tell you something, I think. That love isn't what you're born to. It's what chooses you. Emily sat with that through the night, through the 3 days that followed, through the funeral and the burial, and the strange liminal period where grief was supposed to be happening, but instead she was just waiting. Waiting for something she didn't have a name for yet. Waiting for whatever came next. What came next arrived on a Tuesday morning, 9 days after the will was read. Emily was at the flagship store on 4th Avenue, walking the floor with Marcus, who'd been Robert's right hand for 12 years, and who was still learning how to exist in a store that didn't contain his former boss. She was examining a batch of upholstery that had just been rejected from a supplier, a flaw in the stitching pattern that was barely visible, but would become more pronounced with wear, when she saw them in the window. Her parents, walking toward the front door. Emily's hands didn't shake. She handed the upholstery sample back to Marcus and watched him understand, without any words being said, that something had arrived. She moved toward the front desk and positioned herself so that the counter was between her and the entrance, not as a barrier but as a statement. This is my place. You are entering it. Emily. Her father was attempting warmth again, but the store had changed the acoustics of his voice, made it smaller somehow. We wanted to see where you worked. Where you'll be working, I should say. The store was full. It was a Tuesday morning, and they had walk-in customers and a styling consultation happening in the back room, and 3 employees processing an online order. Every person there knew who Emily was. Every person there had, in the past 3 years, had a conversation with her about inventory management, or customer service, or the specific requirements of their job. How can I help you? Emily said, and she kept her voice in the register she used with clients, polite, professional, distant. We wanted to talk about the company, her mother said. She was holding a leather portfolio. Emily recognized the brand. It was expensive. It was new. We've been reviewing the financial statements, the ones that were attached to the will documentation. Those are confidential, Emily said. I assume your attorney obtained them, which means they're covered under attorney-client privilege. But if you have questions about the company's operations, you can submit them in writing to Jonathan Pierce, and we'll respond through the proper legal channels. Her father's expression was changing. The warmth was receding, and something harder was taking its place. We're not trying to be difficult. We just think, as family... We're not family, Emily said. The words came out calmly, but they came out clear. You signed away that relationship. You took $23,000 for it. You don't get to walk into my business and pretend otherwise. She saw the moment her mother's face did something close to crumple, saw the moment her father's jaw tightened, and she saw Margaret arriving from somewhere in the back of the store, moving toward the counter with a purpose that everyone in the space could read. Margaret, who worked part-time now that Robert was gone, who had been cleaning the stockroom and had somehow sensed the arrival of something that needed her physical presence. I think you should leave, Margaret said quietly. She was standing next to Emily now, slightly in front of her, and there was no politeness in her voice. There was only boundary. There was only the sound of a woman who had raised a child saying, "Not on my watch." Her parents left. Emily watched them move out of the store and down the street, moving in the direction they'd come from, She didn't watch long. She turned to Margaret and nodded, and Margaret squeezed her arm once, and the moment passed. But something had shifted. Some line had been crossed, and Emily had stood on the correct side of it. That night, in the war room they created in Jonathan's conference space, Emily began the methodical work of understanding what she was protecting. Jonathan spread documents across a long table like a battlefield map. Colors, codes, arrows indicating flow, the business structure, the cash flows, the vulnerabilities, the areas where, if someone with knowledge wanted to damage things, they could do damage. "Your parents hired an attorney," Jonathan said, spreading a letter across the table like evidence. "Victor Lane. He was involved in a contested will situation 7 years ago, where he managed to get a hearing on very thin grounds. He knows how to exploit ambiguity." Emily looked at the letter. It was threatening in the way formal legal threats are, couched in language about family interests and reasonable accommodations and avenues for resolution. What it said, beneath the language, was, "We're coming for what's yours." "What did my uncle do?" Emily asked. "Exactly. When he knew they might come back. What did he do to prepare for this?" Jonathan smiled, and it was a smile that had something like joy in it. He prepared everything. He documented everything. He made videos of himself discussing his mental state, his intentions, and his reasons for his decisions. He had your biological parents followed. He recorded phone calls. He built a case that would make it nearly impossible for anyone to contest his choices. But more than that, Jonathan leaned back in his chair. He taught you. He knew that the best protection wasn't documents. It was clarity. Clarity about what? About what you were worth. Not the money, not the business, but your own worth. The fact that you were a person worth protecting. That's what he spent 17 years teaching you. So that when this moment came, you would know it clearly. You wouldn't question it. You wouldn't wonder if you deserved the protection. You would simply understand that you did. Emily sat with that. Around her, the documents and colors and arrows created a map of everything that could be taken from her, everything that would need defending. And underneath all of it, like a bedrock, was the understanding that she was worth defending. That 17 years of breakfast at 6 a.m, of help with homework, of silence when silence was what she needed, of showing up, that all of it had been an answer to a question her parents had asked when they signed her away. "Are you worth something?" "Yes," they'd said, in the only language they knew. "You're worth $23,000. Her uncle had answered the same question differently. He'd answered it by spending 17 years and every ounce of his substantial energy proving that she was worth everything. That she was worth preparing for. That she was worth a legacy. The legal attack came in waves. First, the letter-threatening contest. Then, the media outreach, carefully placed hints to the business journals that the Carter inheritance was irregular and that there were family concerns. Then, the filing. An official petition to contest the will on the grounds that Robert had been unduly influenced by Emily, that she had isolated him from his biological family, that the will didn't reflect his true intentions. Every wave Jonathan met with documentation. Every insinuation they countered with evidence, the recordings, the investigators' reports, the medical evaluations, the previous restraining orders, the fact that Robert had been in perfect health and full possession of his faculties until the moment of his death. A sudden aneurysm, sudden and complete, and nothing to do with stress or influence or anything except the terrible randomness of biology. Emily moved through the company. She learned things. She made decisions. She called meetings with the staff and explained what was happening and why. And she watched them choose, every single one of them, to stand with her. Not because she was Robert's niece, but because she was competent, because she understood what they did and why it mattered, because she showed up. The hearing came on a Thursday. Emily wore the black dress. It seemed appropriate. Margaret came and sat in the gallery. Jonathan brought 2 associates. Her parents arrived with Victor Lane, who was exactly what Emily had imagined. Slick, assured, ready to make her father's weakness sound like concern and her mother's absence sound like love. The judge was a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a docket that was already 2 hours behind. She wanted this done quickly. Emily was grateful for that. Victor Lane stood and made his argument. Undue influence. A young woman, emotionally vulnerable after her parents' departure, now isolated with an uncle who had no other heirs, no other family. Over 17 years, a slow corruption of her judgment. A will that benefited her entirely at the expense of people who'd had a biological relationship to the deceased. It sounded almost plausible. It was crafted to sound plausible. Jonathan stood. He held up the document, the relinquishment of parental rights. He read it aloud. He explained the circumstances under which it was signed, and he presented the check stub. Then he played the recording. Robert's voice, clear and steady and impossible to deny, discussing his reasons for his decisions, his love for his niece, his intention to protect her from the people who'd abandoned her, his sound mind, his clarity of purpose. He called witnesses, store managers who testified about Robert's ongoing engagement with the business, his lack of isolation, his deliberate mentorship of Emily, the family physician who'd examined Robert quarterly for 15 years and attested to his mental acuity, Margaret, who sat in the witness chair with her hands folded and spoke about Robert's character with the kind of authority that only comes from true knowledge. When it came time for cross-examination, Victor Lane had very little. He could attack the witnesses, but their testimony didn't waver. He could suggest alternatives, but the documentation was too thorough. He could appeal to the judge's sense of fairness, but fairness isn't the same as law, and the law was clearly on Emily's side. The judge issued her ruling. The petition was dismissed. The will was upheld. The no-contact provision that Robert had included, protecting Emily and Margaret from legal action, from harassment, from contact of any kind, was enforced as a restraining order. Daniel and Laura Carter were forbidden from approaching Emily, from contacting her, from entering businesses where she was employed, from any action that could be construed as harassment. Emily heard it from inside her own body, as if she were watching herself listen. She heard the judge's voice, authoritative and final. She heard her father's sharp intake of breath. She heard her mother begin to cry, the sound of it small and unavailing in a courtroom where everyone had already decided that her tears meant nothing. Outside the courthouse, the Seattle rain was coming down hard, the kind that comes in January when the sky has given up any pretense of mercy. Emily stood on the steps and felt it on her face, and she didn't move away from it. Behind her, Jonathan was shaking the rain from his jacket. Margaret was standing at her elbow. The city was moving around them in its ordinary way, people hurrying to where they needed to be, the ordinary Tuesday of other people's lives. "It's over," Jonathan said. "Is it?" Emily asked. And she realized she didn't feel the way she thought she would feel. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel released. She felt held, as if by the rain itself, by everything that had led to this moment, by the weight of clarity. "It's over," Margaret said, and she took Emily's arm, and they walked down the courthouse steps together, into the rain, toward the car that was waiting to take them home. The business continued. It had continued through the grief, through the legal battle, through all of it, because Robert had built it right. He'd built it to survive him, to survive the loss of his own hands. The orders went out. The clients received their deliveries. The staff showed up. The money moved through the accounts like blood through a body, sustaining, reliable. Emily found herself working 12-hour days, not out of stress, but out of engagement. She understood now what her uncle had been doing. All those years when he'd brought her to the warehouse, shown her fabric bolts, explained the difference between a seam that would last and one that would fail. He'd been teaching her the vocabulary of care. He'd been showing her that there was a way to love something, a business, a home, a group of people, that involved showing up and paying attention and understanding exactly what would break it, She went to the flagship store on a morning 6 weeks after the hearing. The new collection from their supplier in Italy had arrived, and she spent the morning running her hands over leather, over wood, over the textures that would eventually become the homes where other people would live their lives. She thought about all the hands that had touched these materials before her. The craftspeople in Florence, the logistics coordinators, the shipping companies, all the invisible work that went into moving beauty across the world. Marcus approached her with a smile that said he knew exactly what she was thinking. "He'd be proud," Marcus said. "I know," Emily replied, and she meant it not as a statement of hope, but as a fact, as surely as she knew the difference between a quality seam and a poor one. At night, she sat in the house on Maple, and Margaret would make dinner, and they would eat together at the kitchen table where Emily had sat every night for 17 years. After dinner, Margaret would clean, and Emily would take her uncle's watch, the one he'd worn every day, the one that now sat on her wrist. And she would lock the store remotely, check the security systems, review the next day's schedule, the rituals of stewardship. One evening, she found herself in her uncle's office, the one that was technically hers now, but which still felt like his. The walls were lined with photographs. Robert and Emily, when she was 10, and he was teaching her how to ride a bike. Robert and Margaret, at some company event 30 years ago, both of them young and laughing. Robert and his business partner, a man who died in 1999, cutting the ribbon at the original showroom. Emily took down the photos one by one and looked at them. She was searching for something, though she wasn't sure what. Some message, some proof, some word that her uncle had left for her that said, "You were always supposed to inherit this. You were always supposed to be strong enough." But there were no words. There was only the evidence of his life, spread across the walls. The choices he'd made. The person he'd decided to become when a 10-year-old girl had arrived at his door with nothing but a small suitcase and a very large capacity for silence. Margaret appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of tea. "You're looking for something," she said. "I'm not sure what." "You're looking for permission," Margaret said, and she set the tea down on the desk. "You're looking for him to tell you that you're allowed to be happy, that you're allowed to move forward, that this isn't a punishment, you carrying what he built." Emily looked at her. Margaret had been right about so many things, had guided her with such careful hands, that Emily had learned to trust her as she trusted gravity, as something fundamental and absolute. "What if I fail?" Emily said. "What if I'm not good enough?" "Then you fail," Margaret said simply. "Your uncle failed at many things. He failed at marriage. He failed at keeping friendships that didn't nourish him. But the things he committed to, he succeeded at, because he paid attention, because he showed up, because he understood what mattered and what didn't." Margaret sat down across from her. "You're just like him. You've been just like him since you were 10 years old. You just needed to grow tall enough to see it." Spring came to Seattle that year, with an unexpected warmth. The rain softened. The days got longer. Emily found herself walking through neighborhoods in the evening, looking at houses, at the way people had arranged their lives inside the spaces they'd chosen. She saw colors on walls that she recognized from the company's palette. She saw furniture arrangements that reflected the kind of thinking the store taught. Everywhere she went, she saw the ripple of her uncle's work, the way he'd shaped the world's approach to home, to beauty, to the understanding that the spaces you lived in mattered. She drove past the original showroom one afternoon. The building was much smaller than she'd expected, much less impressive. Robert had started with this. A single room with windows that faced north and never got full light. She parked across the street and looked at it, trying to imagine her uncle, 20 years younger, standing in that space and believing it could become something. Believing that it mattered. Believing that beauty was worth arguing for, worth building, worth protecting. A man came out of the building and locked the door. He was young, maybe 30, wearing work clothes. He glanced at Emily's car, registered her there, registered that she was watching. She expected him to feel threatened or suspicious. Instead, he nodded once. a gesture of recognition between people who both understood that places meant something, that you could feel someone's presence in a building long after they'd left it. Emily drove home to the house on Maple. Margaret was in the kitchen, doing something with vegetables, the kind of work that had filled 17 years of afternoons. "You went to the old place," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "How did you know?" "You always have the same look when you do, like you're seeing it all again for the first time." Emily set her bag down and washed her hands and began to help with the vegetables. They worked in the kind of silence that doesn't require words. The knife went through the produce with the soft sound of familiar tasks. Outside, the evening was coming on. Somewhere in the city, people were closing their stores, locking their offices, moving toward their homes. Somewhere, people were living in the houses they'd furnished from her uncle's showroom, the spaces he'd helped them imagine. "I think I understand it now," Emily said. "Understand what?" Margaret asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. Why he kept the records, why he documented everything, why he prepared for them to come back. Emily set down the knife. He wasn't trying to protect the business, or the house, or the money. He was trying to protect my ability to say no, to see clearly, to understand that I was worth protecting. He knew that if I could do that with them, if I could look at the people who abandoned me and recognize that for what it was, without flinching, then I could do anything. I could run the company. I could make decisions. I could love people and protect them, and not question my right to exist. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said quietly. That's exactly what he was doing. They finished the vegetables. Margaret cooked. They ate. After dinner, Emily sat in the office that was hers now, and she looked at the photographs again, but differently. Not searching anymore, just witnessing. Just acknowledging that the man who had raised her had spent 17 years teaching her how to be strong, and not the kind of strength that comes from never being hurt, the kind that comes from being hurt and choosing anyway, to care, to show up, to build something that would last. The watch on her wrist ticked the seconds forward. Somewhere in the city, the flagship store was closed and locked, the inventory secure, the lights dimmed. The company her uncle had built was continuing, moving forward, carrying forward the understanding that beauty and quality and care mattered, that homes mattered, that the spaces people lived in shaped them, and therefore the people who created those spaces were doing something real. Emily touched the watch, felt the metal warm from her skin, and she allowed herself the smallest smile. Not because the pain was gone. The pain of abandonment doesn't fully leave. She understood that now. It becomes integrated. It becomes part of the shape of who you are. But because something had shifted. Because she was no longer waiting for permission to be whole. Because she had inherited something far more valuable than money or property or a company. She had inherited clarity. She had inherited the knowledge, tested and proven, that she was worth protecting. That she was worth the careful hands of someone who loved her. That her life was something precious and singular, and that the right response to that knowledge wasn't to be grateful in a way that diminished her. It was to steward it, to pass it forward, to show the people she would meet in her future what it looked like to be someone who had been truly loved. Margaret knocked softly on the office door. "Tea?" she asked. "Yes," Emily said. "That would be perfect." They sat together in the kitchen, in the warm light of the house on Maple, drinking tea and not needing to speak about anything at all. Outside, the Seattle evening was cool and dark. Somewhere, her parents were living whatever life they'd created after the hearing. Somewhere, they were probably still processing the loss of the inheritance they'd believed would save them. But Emily didn't think about that. Emily thought about the warmth of the mug in her hands, about the steady presence of the woman across from her, about the watch on her wrist, taking her forward into whatever future she would create, with her own hands, with careful attention to what mattered. The inheritance was complete. Not the money or the business, though those were real, but the inheritance that lasted. the understanding that she was a person worth preparing for. That she was a person worth love, not because of what she could provide, but simply because she existed. That she was capable of building something beautiful, something that would outlast her. Something that would tell the people who came after her what her uncle had understood from the moment she walked through his door with her small suitcase and her very large heart. That everyone deserves a home. That everyone deserves to be loved by someone who stays. That everyone, no matter where they came from, has the capacity to choose family, to choose to matter, to choose to build. And that is the greatest inheritance of all.